देखो उड़ी उड़ी जाए।
दो दिल उड़े ऊंचे आसमानों में जुड़े। दो दिल उड़े ऊंचे आसमानों में जुड़े। मुझे कब था पता इसका, तेरे प्रेम का एक तारा मन में यूं पल पल बाजेगा।
मुझे कब थी खबर इसकी, मेरे मन के सिंहासन पर तू सदा को यूं बिराजेगा। कोई भी कठिनाई हो या कोई हो मजबूरी, तेरी मेरी एक भी पल होवे नहीं दूरी।
माझे से लिपटी ये पतंग जुड़ी जुड़ी जाए। उड़ी उड़ी जाए, उड़ी उड़ी जाए, दिल की पतंग देखो उड़ी उड़ी जाए।
ये जो पतंग है तेरे ही संग है, तेरी ही ओर देख मुड़ी मुड़ी जाए।
दो दिल उड़े ऊंचे आसमानों में जुड़े। दो दिल उड़े ऊंचे आसमानों में जुड़े।
Kaitak and Dambora are ancient instruments of Afghanistan which have attractive tunes. This group wishes to show our Jamaat worldwide the beauty within the sounds of these instruments which they may never have been exposed to. Their participation in the Jubilee Arts Festival is to break down barriers and build bridges by sharing artistic expressions with the Jamaat from all sides of the world.
I shall talk today about encounters. Encounters. When two people meet, or two particles, or two cultures. In that crucial moment of interaction, the results of an encounter are determined. In the simplest of encounters, say with two billiard balls, the outcome is a predictable result of position, velocity, and mass. But the encounters that interest me most are not so simple. In the encounters of people and cultures, much depends on the path that each has taken to that point. These are not stochastic processes. The subjects have histories. The encounter has complexity and rich dimensionality. The result of an encounter between two people or between two cultures is shaped by the assumptions of each, by their respective goals, and perhaps more directly relevant to a university, by the repertoire of responses that each has learned. Encounters, therefore, have aspects of both the general and the specific. What makes our current time distinctive are the new combinations of people and cultures that are participating in these encounters.
یا علی مدد، خوش آمدید. تشکر از اینکه به یکی دیگر از برنامه‌های تأمل در شب‌های جمعه به ما پیوستید. می‌خواهم که به طور خاص به همه اعضای جماعت، اعضای خانواده‌های با مذاهب مختلف و همه کسانی که از سراسر کشور و جهان برنامه ما را تماشا می‌کنند خوش آمدید بگویم. ما در هر شب جمعه مخاطبان فوق‌العاده‌ای داریم. نام من کامل کرملی است. من مجری برنامه اخبار و گزارشگر اخبار جهانی تورنتو هستم. و از آنجا که احساس میکنم رابطه بسیار نزدیک بین ما وجود دارد، میخوام یک راز کوچک را با شما در میان بگذارم. من مثل یک مجری واقعی اخبار تلویزیون در حین وظیفه در بالای تنم کورتی پوشیدم، اما در پایین با لباس خواب هستم. فکر کردم که مجبورم آن را پوشیده نگه دارم. بله، شما همیشه میپندارید که همه چیز درست است. خوب درست است، همه ما فقط بالاتنه خوب میپوشیم، اما زیر میز شلوار ورزشی یا در تابستانها شلوارک میپوشیم. حالا با افشای این راز شاید من اخراج شوم، اما من یقین دارم که این راز بین ما میماند و شما آن را به هیچ کس نمیگویید، زیرا ممکن است که اخراج شوم. پس همین راز بین ما و شما باشه. خب، امیدوارم همه ایتان از روزهای اول بهار لذت ببرید. ماه اپریل تازه شروع شده است. این دیگر یک شوخی یا دروغ ناوقت اپریل نیست. با سپری شدن یک سال متاسفانه کووید هنوز در بین ما هست. میدانید دقیقاً یک سال قبل در همین روز بود که من میزبان برنامه تأمل در شب‌های جمعه بودم. من تعجب میکنم که چرا ما را در روزهای دروغ اپریل میزبان برنامه میسازند. میدانید من باید با فرد مسئول در این باره صحبت کنم. شاید او یک فرد جدی باشد. آخر همیشه که لازم نیست من در روزهای دروغ‌های اپریل میزبان این برنامه باشم. خب، این هم پیامی به سازمان دهندگان برنامه. به هر حال گرچه ما در طول بیشتر از یک سال در قرنطین بودیم، اما یکی از روزنه‌های امید نسل شگفت‌انگیز هنر، موسیقی و فیلم در بین جامعه ما بوده که در دوران قرنطین رشد یافتند. این نسل افراد فوق‌العاده به استعدادی بودند که نه تنها وظیفه سرگرمی ما را به دوش گرفتند، بلکه قصه های در مورد خود و جامعه ما را در طول همگیری به اشتراک گذاشتند. بنابراین این یک وظیفه بسیار بسیار مهمی بوده که ما بر عهده گرفته ایم. خواه این نواها، ویدیوهای موسیقی و مستندهای اسماعیلی باشد یا برنامه‌های خاص خوشحالی. مطمئن هستم بیشتر شما این برنامه‌ها را دیده اید. اسماعیلیان در سراسر دنیا واقعا نگاهی به این دوران دارند که ما کی هستیم و داستانهایی را که معرف فرهنگ و تمدن ما است با دیگران شریک می سازند. و من به شما به عنوان یک خبرنگار می گویم که این مرا به یاد توصیه هایی می اندازد که مهم است تا داستانهای خود را به اشتراک بگذاریم و اگر ما این کار را نکنیم کسی دیگری خواهد کرد. بنابراین امشب ما به برخی از قصه گوهای خود نگاه خواهیم کرد و می آموزیم که آنها چگونه قصه های خود و قصه های جامعه ما را بیان می کردند. اکنون در حالی که امشب فیلمسازان را مورد بررسی قرار می دهیم، باید نقاشان، موسیقیدانان، شاعران و همه کسانی که قصه های خود را به شیوه خودشان بازگو می کنند از یاد نبریم، زیرا آنها کار مهمی انجام می دهند. پس در واقع مجموعه گسترده ای از داستان سرایان وجود دارد. حالا با گفتگوی خود را با یک قصه‌گوی برجسته، فریدون همانی شروع می کنیم. او مرد بزرگی است و کارهای زیادی کرده است. بعداً از برخی از فیلمسازان آینده میشنویم و با شیوه کار آنها آشنا میشویم. سپس بخش دیگری گفتگو درباره کووید را داریم تا کمکی باشد برای پاسخ به سوالات مبرم جماعت در مورد وضعیت فعلی کووید و تطبیق واکسن ها. همه میدانیم که این روند به سرعت به پیش می رود. در آخر طبق معمول برنامه را با موسیقی به پایان میبریم. همیشه این بخش هیجان انگیز است. اما ابتدا اجازه دهید صحبت‌های خود را با آقای فریدون همانی شروع کنم. فریدون خبرنگاری را در سال 1979 در تلویزیون محلی وانکوور به نام CKVU آغاز کرد و با سفری به قاهره با گزارش اخبار بین‌المللی شروع به کار نمود. سپس او با عنوان خبرنگار خارجی CNN برای رسانه‌های مختلف ایالات متحده کار کرد و در این مدت فریدون اخبار مهم را گزارش کرد به شمول جنگ بوسنیا. او در واقع همه اخبار را پوشش داد و همه وقایع را هم دید. او همچنان رویدادهای مهم تاریخ جامعه ما را ثبت کرد و شمول اولین بازدید مولانا حاضر امام از تاجیکستان. با آن خیلی لحظه تاریخی مهم بود که فریدون توانست آن را ضبط نماید. فریدون حالا شرکت تولید رسانه‌ای خود به نام لینکس پروداکشن را دارد و خدمات تولید، توزیع، روابط رسانه‌ای و ویرایشی را برای سازمان‌ها به شمول EKDN انجام می‌دهد. فریدون با استفاده از ویدیو رسانه‌های چندگانه‌ای به جهانیان پیام می‌رساند که آنها چه کار می‌کنند و چرا کار آنها مهم است. بنابراین او یک شخصیت چند وجهی و با استعداد است. پس بدون بگو مگوهای زیادی اجازه دهید شما را با آقای فریدون همانی آشنا کنم.
Faridun, welcome to Friday Night Reflections. Such an honor to have you here and looking forward to our conversation. There's so much I want to ask you about, but let's go right to the beginning. We both have the same start, although a few years apart in British Columbia, at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. You had your start there. I had my start there. But back then, you were a bit of an underdog. And just tell me a little bit about your start there and what you were told coming out of BCIT.
Well, I went into BCIT completely by accident. Or I wanted to go to BCIT to look at the courses in business administration or financial management and so on. And I turned the page backwards in the school prospectus and saw broadcast TV, radio, journalism. When I saw broadcast journalism, something in me told me that that's what I wanted. So eventually, when I got into there, it was all white faces. It was very unusual for somebody like me to be in there. It was also a time when BCIT guaranteed that 80 or 90% of the graduates will get jobs at the end. And the job sometimes meant if you were in a small town, you would be the news director, the sweeper, the announcer, the newsreader, the writer, the everything. And for that, they gave on their presentation a very, very high level of marks. And for all the professors at the time, their instructors, I had the wrong accent, I was not arable, and therefore I was not employable. So I'm actually a flunkey from BCIT.
And so you started at BCIT, but then how was the transition to the world of news, especially when you were being told that, you know, you might not be able to make it?
So I was very lucky because I did my internship at CKVU. It was a small local TV station. And just at that time, the CRTC mandated CKVU to produce majority of its hour-long news show, not just take the feed from Global and call it a news show. So suddenly there was employment possibilities. I was there and I got the job. And I started as a gopher, as a photocopier for the scripts for the writers, eventually worked my way into writing. And within a year and a half or so, I was producing the weekend show at CKVU. So my advantage was it was a small TV station, so I was able to actually do whatever I wanted to do.
Yeah, well, we all have to get our start somewhere. Even I started off in a small town station in northern BC, but you climbed the ladder pretty quickly and climbed to some really big heights here. Where did you go and what networks did you work for?
Well, I was really very, very happy at CKVU. It was a job that was my dream job. I was 24 years old. I was doing investigative reporting. I was doing producing. I was doing the show producing. I had everything I wanted. And all of a sudden, that job was gone. So at that time, when I looked around and I saw there was stuff going on in Iran, the revolution, the hostage taking, the Camp David agreement in the Middle East between Israel and Egypt and so on. And I thought, while I'm waiting, I don't have a job, and the prospects of a second job, that lucky break, were not there. I just took off for hoping to get to the Middle East. And I didn't. But I went to Kenya first, and I covered a few conferences there. And then I arrived in Cairo literally the night before President Sadat was shot dead, October 6, 1981. And there my luck changed. There I knocked on doors, and I went to CNN, which was 1 year old. CNN used to be called Chicken Noodle News in those days because nobody took it seriously. And they needed a sound man. And although I'd never done sound in my life except at BCIT when I was learning to use a camera, I put my hand up, I got the job, and that was the start of a whole new world. Then I stayed around in the Middle East and eventually covered Beirut and Lebanon and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the return of the Sinai to Egypt, all that in a matter of like months from getting there.
Well, you create your own luck and you really bet on yourself, Faridin, so it really looked like it paid off. But then you switched to humanitarian work from news, so a little bit of a different trajectory. How did that happen?
So most of the news I covered for NBC, ABC News, and then I went to Worldwide Television News, and I was the bureau chief for Central Eastern Europe for WTN. Most of my career was doing conflict reporting. So I would be field producing from Beirut, from Damascus, from riots in India or Pakistan for that matter. But later on at WTN, I covered the Czechoslovakia revolution at the time. And then came the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. So I was in Baghdad for a good part of Baghdad and Amman for a good part of the year. And right when I came back to Budapest, where I was based, the breakup of Yugoslavia began. So that was a really intense 5 years of my life where I had been mock executed. I had survived, I came that close to being blown up by mines or whizzing bullets. And eventually, in 1995, I got wounded in a bomb explosion in Sarajevo when the Serbs hit the building that was a TV station where our offices were. At that time, I lost vision in my right eye. I was operated at Sarajevo Hospital. And through the UN, eventually I was evacuated and fixed at Johns Hopkins in Maryland. But that was a turning point in my life because those were really moments. If a cat has 9 lives, I knew I'd lost my 6 lives for sure, you know. So I decided to take a break from news, and completely by timing, by coincidence, whatever, the first paid production job I had was when Hazri Imam was visiting East Africa. And I had a call to say, we need a second crew. They'd taken one of the crews that we worked with anyway. And we need a second team to come and work. And that's how I got my foot into the world of the AKDN. Although I was no stranger to it, because in 1989, I'd interviewed Maulana Hazri Imam in Cairo during the Aga Khan for architecture. And I had I'd gone through the Aga Khan school system and hospital system and so on. So I was aware of the AKDN's work, but never quite like this. I had no idea the scale, the depth, the breadth of the projects. It was mind-boggling. But that was the way I got into covering stuff for the AKDN.
Well, Faridun, what a journey. And I think I can speak for everyone when I say we're all glad that you're okay and survived and still have 3 of those 9 lives left. But, you know, as a newsman myself, we tell specific stories on television, usually have to be crunched down to 2 minutes. I've always been curious as to what it's like on the other side for you, telling stories for a global, development program for an institution like AKDN. What is the storytelling format like for you, having worked in both worlds?
it's a very, very different way of telling the story. The news background news was, as you know, is like everything within a minute and a half, especially when you were with network news like ABC. It had to be really a compelling story for the show producer to give you 2 minutes. So the news agency was a little bit more flexible, but still you had a 2 minute, 2.5 minute maximum. You tell the story, you give the material, it's a soundbite or two and it's done. Telling the story of the kind of work that the AKDN or some of the UN organizations do that we work with requires a lot more time. Now, we're talking about the 90s. In 1997, when I first started doing these projects for AKDN, we had the luxury of time. We really didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have that kind of internet access. We didn't have social media. And I think the budgets were a little better. So we were able to spend time and film a week or 2 weeks or sometimes even 3 weeks to do the story. And in those days, you told the story in 30 minutes. So it was a very different way. But the first, I had to get past my news mindset, because I was a very Puritan news person, like you cannot change the set. You got to tell the stories, you got to make sure that it's neutral or it's told in a way that it's fair and so on. And here I'm now telling somebody else's story. And psychologically, I had to make a break between being an impartial newsman to telling somebody else's story, but without being a flag for that organization, because it's not PR, but it's still telling the stories in these parts of the world that very often were already hit by either wars or natural disasters or something like that. So there had to be a psychological change, and then there had to be the freedom to tell the story in a longer format in those days.
Well, I think it's a lovely thing that you had more time to tell the stories. Any other ways where, the storytelling has changed, not only between news and telling stories for a developmental agency, a humanitarian agency? What other differences should we know of that exist there?
So when we started doing the work with the AKDN, our stories would be about 30 minutes long. It would take 3 weeks to shoot the film. It was all analog editing. There was no internet. There was no nothing. So it was couriers going back and forth. So a 1 month or 2 month turnaround from a shoot was normal and was actually pretty good. But as time went on, the 30 minutes, people started saying the optimum time that people can have attention to the story is 18 minutes. And then it was 12 minutes. Then it was 6 minutes. Then it was 3 minutes. And now we get requests for please make it a minute because of Instagram and because of Twitter and because of this and social media and so on. So the irony is that I went from a 2-minute news story to telling a story in 30 minutes or more. And now it's down to 2 minutes or 1 minute even. And with it, the disadvantage is that they want everything now. So in the old days, even if you did a 3-minute piece, you still took your time, you did it. It came a week later, the production values are higher. Nowadays, it's like a quick turnaround. Just use your phone, just use this, And I think we're losing the art of telling a story because some of these stories are not that superficial. They need depth, they need to be told, they need background, they need context. And now we're losing that just with music and text, and the thing is over, and then that's it. And it's a sad state of affairs, I think, because there must be some need for telling these deeper stories.
That's a very interesting analogy. And speaking of, the difference between storytelling in the past of storytelling now and looking towards the future, you actually have worked with Prince Ali Mohammed. First of all, tell me what that's like. And obviously he's part of this new generation of storytelling.
Yes, that has been such an honor for me to be able to work with Prince Ali on that. The opportunity came about 3 years ago when we got a first call. And Prince Ali mentioned in the call that he wanted to make, first of all, he wanted to say that he'd seen some of the work, because we'd done so many AKDN and EGLOMO related activities over the years. So he obviously watched them. So at that phone call, he said, look, Faridun, I've seen your work. I really like your work. But in all honesty, it does not speak to my generation. I'd like to do these stories that you're doing, but in a way that speaks to my generation, which is 17 to 25. And what I'd like to do is I'd like you to help me get there. So it was very clear that it was his film and not my way of looking at it, but my sort of mentoring or facilitating the way so that we can make the film. So we set off for northern Pakistan that year, where his film Close to Home was made. It was a really amazing journey, and it became very clear that our relationship was that if I was his mentor, he was still my boss and my director, because he knew how he wanted to do the story. He knew what shots he wanted. He knew what he wanted included. And for him to do that, he did sound, he did the interviews, he did some of the shooting, he did the stills, a whole bunch of different skill sets that were needed. And it was a really amazing experience, because I was now able to, the tables were turned actually. I'm now learning from him rather than him learning from me, because now I'm looking at a different way of doing things. The way the camera moves, the way it's framed, the way it is shot, eventually the way it was edited too. And it was more of a learning experience for me than the other way around.
Wow, must have been such an experience. And when you're talking about that difference between two generations of storytellers, you said he had a different way of filming and editing. What was the difference between the final product, from when you first began your journey, when maybe you were his age as a storyteller, versus some of the things he was teaching you?
So one of the main differences is my background is news. So I come from, as you probably know, it's a quick and dirty, this is a shot, this is a shot, this is a shot. And as a news person, you don't rearrange the set. So we had to learn about, I had to learn over the course of my career anyway about, no, you need to place this book here, or this object here, or make a relationship between a parent and a child and move the set around, all of that, which was not a newsy kind of thing. But he comes from a completely filmic background. So when he's looking at the film, he's looking at it from an artistic point of view, from spacing, from framing. After we did the Pakistan trip, we worked on Al-Khimya together in Egypt. But before we went to Egypt, he set us homework that I want you to watch these programs on Netflix. I want you to see how they deal with archiving, how they deal with the treatment of using archive material, how they're framing their shots, how the two cameras should be placed, look at the lighting, all of that myself, the director of photography, our cameraman, and some of the team had to actually look at it all before we actually went back to Cairo and shot. So he was very, very, very specific in what he wanted. And when he was in Cairo and when he was on the set, which was most of the time, he was able to call the frame and look into the camera and say, no, there's reflection coming from that frame in the back. So crumple a piece of paper and put it behind the frame that is in the background so that it does not reflect, and this is lacking a backdrop. So he was hands-on all the way from conception to shooting to post-production to editing to music. It was quite an amazing process to watch him. But the other thing is, for example, the kind of music he picks compared to what I would have picked. How I would have treated the vertical filming that people had done on their phones and how you incorporate it into his film. At one time he joked when I gave a suggestion, he looks at me and says, well, that works for news, but it doesn't work for film. It was a learning process for me for sure.
Wow, what an experience. And so, one of the things I think of thinking about your experience in storytelling and even your experience telling stories with Prince Ali Muhammad is, having done a few projects, videography projects for AKD and myself, I always find one of the biggest challenges is doing the stories justice, because you are a stranger going into someone else's world, and obviously they live a completely different lifestyle than you do. They live in a completely different climate, and so it's always tough to break down that barrier, especially when there are language barriers as well, to go into that world and do their stories justice. So my question for you is, how do you do that? In your years of experience, have you sort of solved that secret of going in there and being able to do somebody else's story and their completely different world from yours justice?
I think you're absolutely right. It's quite difficult to do stories if you want to do them in depth. Where I've been fortunate is, whether it's a work with the UN or other NGOs or AKDN particularly, you get the backup support that you need. So in the preparations, you go through and say, okay, tell me some of the stories of the people we're going to be talking about. What is their background? What is their experience? How have you benefited them? And so on and so forth. So we are armed with all that information even before we go ahead. Example I can tell you, we filmed for Focus Humanitarian in 5 countries basically in 1999. But more recently, about 10 years ago, when one of the worst floods in Pakistan's history, we did a whole lot of filming about AKDN interventions. And I was extremely fortunate to have as my colleague Salima Shiraj. She was the National Council CC for Pakistan. And she did tremendous work in digging out the stories ahead of time, in relaying them to us and us picking to say, this is what we're going to do. And then we planned our schedule. And she was with us on the shoot. And she crossed every barrier, like wherever there was an obstacle, she found a way. If there was no car, she would get a car. If the road was closed, we'd find a way around. But with her local knowledge of language and the culture and all that, we were able to tell stories of the victims of Pakistan floods and the beneficiaries. And sometimes there was just an amazing story of this lady that I still remember, Sultan Zar Bibi, who was elderly. And in Chitral, for example, she was at home with her son and daughter, and the floods just started. She could hear the sound of the floods. And she was very, very worried. And she told her kids, look, I'm worried, I don't like this. And they said, oh, Mom, you worry too much. So she says, no, I want to go take a look. So she went with the daughter out of the house. And when she went, a wave took them away separately, separated them from each other. That's the last thing is she heard the daughter's voice. They were both washed away at a different place. When somebody rescued Sultan Zar Bibi, the first thing she asked was about her daughter and her son. And they said, no, they're okay, but they weren't. And the people didn't know that. Now, it was a tragic story, so it was a multi-dimensional story about focus, about deforestation, about floods, about victims, about loss, about mental illness, about depression. And we couldn't have found that unless we had somebody like Salima with us, or even there was Jahan Seb was the AKF person on the ground. And without their help in teasing the stories out and convincing people to talk to them without us intruding upon them, it's a skill. But we're very, very lucky to have people like them when we go out on the shoots for AKDN.
And so in that example, did they feel like, you did their stories justice? As heartbreaking as it was, did they feel somewhat relieved that, they could get their story out there?
It's always, I'm not sure what the impact is. I don't, for example, even in my news life, I don't know what the impact was then either. Because in Sarajevo and in Bosnia, people had given up. They tried so hard to take it off the headlines, whether it was in Clinton's time or whether it was the British government at the time. Everybody played lip service, and they just wanted Bosnia out of the headlines. And we, day after day after day, we continued going to the same places where the snipers were killing people. We even felt like vultures, and even the Bosnians at some point thought we were vultures because we were attracting the snipers. But we felt it was important that the story be told, and eventually there were results because the world did do something about it. The same way, I don't know what impact we have when we do these stories, but I feel that if one person gets touched by the story and contributes, not just financially, but contributes in a way to making the life of this village better or whatever, then it's been worth it. Then it has changed the course of the life of one person forever. And I think that alone is a positive result.
I know you said it's tough to tell the overall impact of a story because it sort of takes time for that impact to take place too. You could see an impact of a story years later. Having told so many stories over such a long period of time and possibly seeing the impact of some of the stories you told years ago, what were some of the stories that really stuck out to you that you feel like are the most impactful stories you've told?
Impact ranges from whether it's impact on one person's life in this one village, where your $50 contribution helped create a microfinance loan, which eventually meant they could do their business, which eventually meant the beneficiaries could send their kids to university. That's one kind of impact, which we see a lot of the AKDN's work, a lot. The other impact is something like what we showed in Alchemia in Prince Ali's film. What he showed is a 20-year project that transformed the lives of so many people, and the environment and green air and a park for the people that were in a slum area, education prospects for them and all that. So that's a huge impact on a section of society that were the underdogs. One of the ones that I'm working on right now is for the Aga Khan University, which is another story that has to be told because it's quite an amazing story. And that, for example, started with Hazar Imam's announcement that he would start a school of nursing in a medical college in 1964. And it took 20 years before the school opened or the charter was given, 20 years. But when that announcement was made, even the architects who had to go around studying Islamic architecture before they could even submit the drawings or whatever, they described this location as in the middle of the desert at the edge of the city of Karachi. And at that time, people's vision was still, what is that university doing, like so out of town, it's like going to another town. And yet not, right now, it's like a central point in a community grown all around it. But even it grew from a medical college, a school of nursing, which was also some sort of social engineering because it uplifted the lives of women and the status as nurses, which is a whole story that has to be told. But in any case, as it extended and the Aga Khan University extended and it taught more and more and built more, I was having a conversation with Wazir Shams Qasim Laka about the university and its beginnings since we were doing some research on it. And he said at some point, Hazar Imam is talking to Wazir Shams and he says, you know, all that you've seen over all these decades, whatever, what you're looking at is just something that you would see the vision through the keyhole. What you're seeing is just what you can see through the keyhole. Actually, there's a lot more to happen. And that's when you realize that we don't even know what is in the works. I mean, I can tell you countless stories. Like in 1995, we went on a visit with Hazar Imam to Tajikistan. And he was in Korog, and we covered him visiting this Pamir small energy plant, which is an AKF project. So we covered it as a news story in 1995. You know, he's there, he's visiting, he's asking questions, and that was part of the film that we made. But looking at this decade, you realize that grew into something called Pamir Energy, a partnership with the government, where 90-something% of Gorno-Badakhshan was now on the grid or had access to electricity. Not only that, but the electricity was now going across the river into Afghanistan, and it transformed the lives of the communities living on the Afghan side of the border, where they're learning computer skills, learning English, IT. They're doing small business because they've got electricity. They're healthier at home because they've got cookers and not open fires in the home. Entertainment. Young kids are getting jobs in NGOs. They're getting into universities. And there are plans that, if possible, then this lines will go all the way to northern Pakistan. Now, in 1995, I had absolutely no idea. To me, this was just a picture of Hazar Imam looking at this power plant. And 30 years later, you see that, my goodness, you know, what he was thinking and what my capacity was.
Wow, incredible. So with all that in mind, all those stories that you've shared over time and the snippets you've told us, what is your message to the audience here about the impact of storytelling in terms of history, what it can change? You know, we saw in some of the stories you just mentioned, the impact decades later. Just tell us a little bit about the power of a story and what it can change throughout the course of history even.
I'm reluctant to tell you about the what changes in the course of history because I don't know. And I will only know maybe 20 years from now. But like the Pamir Energy project I told you, what Tajikistan was in 1995, where there was no power, majority of the people had no access to electricity, there was no fuel. At that time, technically, the country was still at war. And if you go now, 30 years later, it's a very, very different story. It is still, yes, one of the poorest countries in the world. It still has a lot of problems, but there's so much has happened that has changed the lives of farmers or ordinary people that would never have happened. Be it electricity, be it rural support program, be it farming techniques, it doesn't matter. But all these bits put together makes a huge impact on the community. And I still believe that if we tell the story of one family or one person and somebody feels compelled to donate or contribute or donate time or whatever it is for that project, then that, to me, in the history of that one person, it has changed. So I don't look at history as decades, which is one way of looking at it, which I do look at, but it's not the only way. And the other way, it's how it has changed the life of an individual. And to me, that is a satisfaction. So I still go to different villages in the middle of nowhere and all that, but instead of telling the stories of gloom and doom, I'm actually telling the stories about the people, or they're telling the stories, and hopefully some people will think, okay, there is some positive things in the world. It's not all death and destruction.
Wow. Learned so much just from listening to you, Faridun. Any last pieces of advice you want to pass off to any aspiring filmmakers, or even people who watch films or documentaries very often? Anything you would like to for them to keep in mind and take away from this chat session here?
The thing that comes to my mind is that a lot of my life was not planned. My career in journalism was not planned. My getting a job at CKVU was not planned. My getting into the networks after CKVU was not planned. Somehow these opportunities came and they seemed improbable and impossible at the time. I took the chance, and as many as I won, I lost that many opportunities too. Not lost the opportunities, but lost out in taking those opportunities. They're not all winners. But the point is that take your chances. If you feel you're passionate about something and you want to do it, you do it. Whether it's filmmaking, whether it's news, whether it's any other career you want to do. Without that passion and without that commitment, you're not going to get that kind of feeling that I'm doing. Like if I died today, then I would not complain because I died doing something that I really cared about. And that was how I thought all the time in the war zones that I covered. That if something should happen, at least I'm doing something that I really love doing, and the fact that I was being paid for it. The other thing is that I found, and I've often said this before, that every turn in my life, I've been guided by guardian angels. I can tell you a million stories of every single time where I hit a roadblock or an obstacle or whatever, and I thought this was the end of it. Somehow or the other, a guardian angel in some form or another helped pull me through, and that's how I got through life. It was not through my being very clever, because there's many people who are far more talented than I am, who write better, who produce better and all that. But somehow I've navigated through life with the help of strangers that I'd never met before they came and went in my life, and they were my guardian angels. So keep in mind and keep your eyes and your heart open to these opportunities and to these people. The rest is all, it's destiny,
What an amazing perspective. Faridun Hemani, storyteller, filmmaker, and just a great overall human. We are so grateful for your time and just the knowledge you've passed along to all of us through this conversation. Thank you again.
It's my pleasure, my honor, actually.
بسیار متشکرم که اطلاعات و دانش خود را در اختیار ما قرار دادید. ما همه از شما سپاسگزاریم. فریدون همچنان از آخرین فیلم شاهزاده علی محمد نام برد، الخیمیا، که در این فیلم تأثیرات اجتماعی توسعه پارک الازهر بر جوامع همسایه بررسی می شود. پس بیایید از نمایش برخی از صحنه‌های این فیلم لذت ببریم.
Sometimes simple ideas led to ambitious and complex projects.
Cairo is a very grey city. People living in Cairo are living under 1 square meter per capita of greenery.
To work in historic city is always a high-risk proposition.
It seemed like a mission impossible.
Some dwellers were saying we would pray to God before falling asleep that we would wake up and the house would not crash on our head.
You can't give up on a dream like this. It's such an enormous project that impacts a lot of people here.
اکنون اگر می‌خواهید همه این فیلم را تماشا کنید، الخیمیا را می‌توانید در وبسایت closetohomefilm.com ببینید. در اینجا از حضور شما معذرت میخوام زیرا کم احساساتی میشم، اما فقط تماشای صحنه‌هایی از فیلم و صحبت با فریدون واقعا مرا به فکر و یادآوری تجربیات خودم در حدود 6 یا 7 سال پیش انداخت. ایکیدین برای انجام یک پروژه کوتاه مدت مرا برای کارهای فیلمبرداری و داستان پردازی در خارج از کشور در شمال پاکستان، روستاهای موزامبیک و تانزانیا دعوت کرد و من از نزدیک تأثیرات مثبت کار بشردوستانه ایکیدین و مؤسسات زیرمجموعه آن را بر مردم محل مشاهده کردم. و این فقط یک قصه نیست که من تا ابد به خاطر دارم، بلکه مردمی را که دیدم و از آنها شنیدم که چقدر قدردانی می‌کردند از این که با آنها کمک صورت گرفته بود. دیدنش خیلی شگفت انگیز است و بعد از آن فقط چند سال پیش، فکر کنم 2 سال پیش، فرصت میسر شد که برای مدتی کوتاهی در دانشگاه آسیای مرکزی در قرقیزستان و تاجیکستان تدریس کنم. و فقط با دیدن این قصه گویان جوان در این مناطق و دیدن اشتیاق آنها واقعا قلبم به تپش آمد. من کاملا علاقه دارم ببینم که آینده قصه گویی در جوامع ما، در میان جوامع آنها و در بین سازمانها و مؤسسات ما چقدر پرشور و چقدر روشن است. پس بیایید از چند قصه گویی آینده مطلع شویم.
Yalimadat, my name is Shireen Munji and I'm from, you guessed it, Toronto, Ontario. So my career path in storytelling started with high school. I loved listening to music. I loved listening to the radio. I loved telling stories on the announcer mic at school. And so I turned those joys and those passions and found a program called radio broadcasting. And it was there where we learned the power of writing and the power of your voice. And so with just a script and just your voice and maybe some music and audio cues, you were telling stories.
I really got interested in storytelling at a young age. Probably when I was in elementary school, I had the opportunity to use a stop frame animation camera that one of my teachers had. And I created my first stop frame animation telling a story. And I think that's really what sparked my interest in doing media production.
I think I always had a little bit of a storyteller in me from a young age. I was obsessed with the family camcorder. I used to take it everywhere with me. Whether or not it was a big occasion, I had it right there with me, and probably to the annoyance of a lot of my family members. But there was something about it for me, about being able to capture emotion, scenery, basically anything that was going on, and being able to revisit kind of my point of view, granted my shorter point of view.
One of the reasons that got me into this business was actually pursuing work as a volunteer for our community. In the mid-1980s, 85, when Hazri Imam came to Vancouver to open the Ismaili Center, I'd applied to be a cameraman at that time, and unfortunately I wasn't qualified. So I decided I really wanted to pursue this as a career, and started doing corporate and wedding videos.
What pushed me into film production was during the Golden Jubilee. I would do some voluntary services with the Jamaat, with the Council for Canada, and people would appreciate my work. They would really motivate me into getting this. That's what pushed me more into getting in post-production and even in filming and taking pictures. I am very pleased to work with the Jamaati volunteers and do some editing stuff for them. It's a savor that I will always remember.
We are currently working on 3 movies and 2 series. Some of our clients are Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hallmark, Lifetime, Sony.
I've had the opportunity to volunteer my media production skills in other places. I've been a president of the Canadian Media Educators Association. I've been blessed with opportunities to perform seva in many different capacities, and it's just amazing to be able to not only volunteer my time, but to meet others who are also very passionate and caring about telling our stories.
I've had the opportunity to work on the Juno Awards and the Much Music Video Awards, which are some English language music award shows here in Canada. And I think my work experience on those award shows allowed me the opportunity to volunteer with the AKDN when they were launching the Aga Khan Music Awards. The award show itself was a weekend full of music from all around the world, and it was exactly what I aimed to achieve when I was in school, which was telling stories. It didn't matter what the language was, but telling stories through music.
J'ai eu aussi l'opportunité de travailler avec l'équipe de communication en Lisbonne, en Portugal. Notre travail, c'était vraiment de faire les montages et filmer pendant Diamond Jubilee. Tous ces souvenirs sont des souvenirs qui vont rester à jamais. Un jour, j'aimerais tout raconter ça à mes enfants. Donc, ça va être très touchant. Je suis très fier de participer dans tous ces projets-là.
One of the most significant memory that I have in starting this career was the first time I captured Hazrat Imam arriving to Vancouver and coming down from his airplane. It was just the most highlight of my career, if you could call it.
I remember the first kind of Jamaati media project that I was involved with was actually in September 2014. The Ismaili Center and Aga Khan Museum were opening. It was quite a dynamic shoot as well. Hazrat Imam and then Prime Minister Stephen Harper were moving from the center to the museum or vice versa, and it was quite complex. And I got to work with a fantastic team of people who soon became my mentors, and I think most importantly, I got to use my professional skill set to help tell an important story, not only to me. The opening of a new Ismaili Center and the first ever Aga Khan Museum is so exciting, but it's also exciting to the Jamaat, and to be able to be kind of that conduit or contribute to the Jamaat being able to access information, I think, is just a huge honor and pleasure.
My favorite story has got to be the profile I did on Ayla. She's a 3-year-old who was volunteering at a sports festival, and she was just so committed and so dedicated to her job as water girl. She wanted to give out water to everyone. She knew that the racers needed it. She knew that the spectators needed it, and she was very knowledgeable in what her job was. She was 3 years old. She wanted to be there all day, and she was just so full of joy. She loved the idea of volunteering, and I loved the idea of profiling her and celebrating her.
My advice for the young people or the new storytellers who want to get in the film production or media is to get as much experience as you can.
I think one, if wants to pursue any career in their lifetime, they have to have passion for it and a tenacity to just pursue it relentlessly.
It's a huge space. If you're a storyteller, focus in on what you want to do as that storyteller. Are you the writer? Are you the visionary? Or like the director? Are you the sound designer? All of those roles are so important to telling a story, but you need to know what you want to do. And so when you know what you want to do, it's a lot easier to put yourself out there, to meet people, and to hopefully gain employment.
I'm going to recycle a piece of advice that was given to me that still holds true today, and I still carry it with me. And basically, the advice was, no matter what gig you're in, no matter what position you're in, you should always strive to be the best in the world at that position in that time, because you're the person who's doing it. And so, you know, if you're just starting off and you have to get somebody a cup of coffee, you're going to be the best coffee getter in the world at that point in time. And give it your all, give it your 100%. You're the best in the world, and no job is too small to be the best in the world at.
To just do it. Plan it, write it, produce it. Just that simple. And it doesn't have to be anything elaborate. You don't have to buy special or fancy equipment. Just use your smartphone. Create a 1-minute Instagram story. Just to get yourself started. Even taking a small step will really help you to become more confident in telling your story. And you know, if you think about it another way, if you don't tell your story, who will tell your story? Start now.
به چه استعدادهای شگفت‌انگیز داریم. من فکر می‌کنم که آینده داستانسرایی در میان جوامع ما و سازمان‌های ما بسیار بسیار روشن است. فکر می‌کنم که آنها قطعاً از من و فریدون پیشی می‌گیرند و به زودی به بزرگی دایناسور خواهند شد. اکنون امشب بخش دیگری از گفتگویمان در مورد کووید را پی می‌گیریم.
Hello and Yali Madat. My name is Dr. Karim Jessa and I'm an emergency physician at North York General and at Sick Kids here in Toronto. I've been asked to speak about where we are at this phase of the pandemic. In preparation for this recording, I reached out to a number of my colleagues across the country, including Dr. Amin Sajan from Vancouver, Dr. Alim Perdan from Hamilton, Mukhi Dr. Alim Nagji from Hamilton, and Dr. Taslim Nimji from Humber here in Toronto, and we wanted to share the following messages with you. All across the country, we're seeing wave 3 of COVID, meaning we are seeing a large number of young patients presenting, and most of them are presenting with these variants of concern. These variants of concern are a different strain of COVID that are much more transmissible and are resulting in sicker and sicker patients affecting these younger patients. Our ICUs are filling up with patients from the age of 40 to 60. It's very important that we stick to the program of maintaining physical distancing, washing hands, wearing masks, and avoiding large gatherings. We've come too far in this pandemic to be careless and get infected and let it slip away. We're almost at the end of the pandemic, so let's make sure that we remain vigilant. This is a key message that we all wanted to share with you. Next, we want to talk about vaccines. Alhamdulillah, vaccinations are rolling out across the country, and many of you are confused about which vaccine should we get. Frankly, you should get whichever vaccine you are eligible for first. So, don't worry about which vaccine, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna. Get the first one that you are eligible to get. Our beloved Imam in his Navroz Talika also mentioned the same thing. Get vaccinated. Very, very important that we reach out to our parents, our friends, our neighbors who may have some challenges navigating through this online process of booking for vaccinations. If you have to, help them get vaccinated, and then if they need further instructions, get them help through the access line. Finally, I wanted to mention that it's very, very important that we all stick together. We maintain our relations with people by phone, by Zoom, by whatever we need to. Let's make sure that we're there for each other and that we are supporting each other. We look forward to seeing you all in Jamaat Khana very soon. Thank you very much. Yali Madat.
اکنون این بخش نمایش همیشه تلخ و شیرین است، زیرا قصد داریم به یکی از قسمت‌های مورد علاقه من یعنی موسیقی بپردازیم. اما این همان بخشی نیز است که مجبورم با شما خداحافظی کنم. از اینکه میزبان شما بودم بسیار خوشوقتم. یک بار دیگر بسیار خرسندم که مرا به خانه‌های خود، اتاق‌های نشیمن خود دعوت کردید و شب دیگری از برنامه تأمل در شب‌های جمعه را تماشا نمودید. به من افتخار بخشیدید. ممنون از همه شما. ایمن باشید، سالم باشید و آخر هفته خوبی داشته باشید. شبتان بخیر.
दर पे तेरे हम खड़े हैं मेरे मौला कर दे मुश्किल सबकी आसा मेरे मौला
दर पे तेरे हम खड़े हैं मेरे मौला कर दे मुश्किल सबकी आसा मेरे मौला
मुश्किलों में भी ओ मौला साथ ना छोड़ा। आज भी तेरी तरफ हम देखते मौला, आज भी तेरी तरफ हम देखते